All right, everyone. Hello. Uncover that camera. Hello, hello. I am going to fix my captions here real quick, and we'll get started. There we go. That should be working. All right. So, here we are, ready for another chapter in Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals, Chapter 8. Getting a little bit more interesting now. Getting into a bit more archaeology and stuff, and got away from the narrative of him traveling and all that. And he even mentioned the Neanderthals once in passing in this past chapter. So I'm hoping he'll get to the whole Kingdom of the Neanderthals part here pretty soon. There are only 12 chapters, and we're on 8. So, all right. So this one is called A More Powerful Reality. So, my arms are getting too short. I really need to go get my eyes checked. Get some glasses again. I wore them back in the 90s, and I didn't need them for a long time. Now I do again. All right. It was as far back as 1951 that Mircea Eliade had devoted his substantial book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, to the subject. Yet because Eliade was an authority on the history of religion, not an anthropologist, other scholars were inclined to be dismissive. Besides, at that time, anthropologists believed that shamans were tricksters or psychotics. Briefly speaking, said anthropologist George Devereux in 1956, and this is a quote, by the way, we hold that the shaman is mentally deranged. End of the quote. Even so, the influence of Eliot's book continued to grow and was finally one of the major reasons that shamanism was taken seriously and not dismissed as a mixture of superstition and derangement. Just as a side note, I had to read one of his books in a grad school class, and I was not impressed, to be completely honest. His whole theory was on absolutely everything is either sacred or profane, and there was nowhere in between. It was because he based his study on one very specific group of gypsies that considered absolutely everything sacred or profane. It's like, okay, just because they do, that doesn't mean the whole world does. But anyway, not important at the moment. It was also in 1956 that Michael Harner went to live on the eastern slopes of the Andes to study that culture of the head-shrinking Jivaro Indians, and, as mentioned in the preface of this book, decided to try their drug ayahuasca. He encountered the Ancient Ones, whom he described as dragon-like creatures, who claimed they had created all forms of life on Earth so they could hide inside them. He noted the similarity of this idea to the DNA molecule discovered by Crick and Watson in 1953, and when he described to two missionaries his experience of a gigantic crocodile from whose mouth gushed a torrent of water, they pointed out to him a passage in the book of Revelation about a serpent who cast water out of his mouth as in a flood. When he spoke of his experience to a blind Jivaro shaman and quoted the dragons as claiming that they were the masters of the earth, the shaman smiled and said, quote, "Oh, they're always saying that, but they are only the masters of outer darkness," end quote. Harner had not mentioned that he saw them coming from space. In 1964, Harner returned to Ecuador with the intention of studying shamanism firsthand. He went to the northwestern part of the country where the most the most powerful shamans were reputed to live, and flew to the remote village of Macaz, under the active volcano called Sangay. With a Jivaro guide, he spent all day walking to the house of a renowned shaman named Akachu in the remote forest. In exchange for a shotgun, Akachu agreed to initiate him into the way of the shaman. The first step was to bathe in a sacred waterfall. Their road took them upward into a misty forest. Harner was told to fast. Quote, "You must suffer so that the grandfathers will take pity on you." End quote. On the third night it began to rain, and they broke camp in the dark, too cold and hungry to sleep. Their only illumination came from flashes of lightning. Harner soon lost sight of the other two in the forest, and his shouts brought no reply. He encountered many forks and had to choose again and again. After a day of staggering through the forest, he was still alone and cut himself branches to make a lean-to shelter. The next morning he heard the boom of the shotgun and tried to run toward it. He found himself climbing down a precipitous canyon. Eventually he found his companions standing beside an immense waterfall. He collapsed as he reached them. After they had struggled through mist heavy with rain, Akachu led him into the sacred cave under the waterfall. This was the house of the grandfathers. Here, in spite of being frozen to the bone, Harner experienced a sense of deep calm. Finally, Akachu led him back along the cliff face, and they scaled the steep slope of slippery clay until they were overlooking the waterfall. There Akachu began to scrape stems of green bark into a gourd, then crush them to squeeze out the juice. This was the liquid that Harner would drink. He was warned that if he saw something frightening, he should not flee. Harner knew of a number of Indians who had fled in panic after drinking the datura juice and died by drowning or falling from a cliff. A few hours later, in total darkness, he drank the juice whose disagreeable taste reminded him of green tomatoes. He felt numb. Then an immense terror swept through him. He was certain his companions meant to kill him, but they held him down while he believed a horde of savages was restraining him. Then he became unconscious. When he woke, lightning was flashing and the ground was trembling. He jumped to his feet, and a hurricane-like wind blew him down. Then he saw a great serpentine form writhing toward him. About to run away, he remembered the shaman's staff Akachu had made for him. It was not there, but he found a stick. As the monster split into two intertwined serpents, he charged it with the stick. There was an ear-splitting scream, and suddenly the forest was empty and silent. He experienced deep serenity, then lost his senses again. When he woke up, it was midday, and he ravenously ate some monkey meat and drank warmed beer. When he started to tell Akachu and the guide what he had seen, Akachu silenced him, warning him that if he spoke of it, he would lose all he had suffered for. So he returned to Akachu's house and was taught how to acquire spirit helpers, or tsensaks, to help him to cure the sick. Later, Harner went on to study shamanism among several North American Indian groups and learned how shamanism could be practiced without ayahuasca or other drugs. On his return, he published articles describing his experiences, which made his reputation. Then he spoilt it all by writing The Way of the Shaman, in which he went on to try to explain how others could practice shamanism. This self-help book caused a violent reaction among his academic colleagues, who felt he had joined the ranks of the Californian gurus. As far as academia was concerned, he became an outcast, in spite of which the book has gone on to become a classic. Harner's Way of the Shaman was one of the influences that led another anthropologist, Jeremy Narby, to go to the Pichis Valley in the Peruvian Amazon in 1985 to study the culture of the Ashaninka Indians. The opening sentence of his book, The Cosmic Serpent, is, quote, "The first time an Ashaninka man told me that he had learned the medicinal properties of plants by drinking a hallucinogenic brew, I thought he was joking," end quote. In due course, Narby would learn to take such statements seriously, and he would be convinced that it was possible to learn a great many things from ayahuasca, including the properties of DNA. The reason Narby asked the question about medicines was that there are around 80,000 species of plants in the rainforest, so to find a remedy by mixing them together would mean testing more than 3,000 million different combinations. The nerve poison karure, for example, is made from a combination of plants, and the first stage is to boil them for 3 days while staying well away from the boiling liquid, whose fumes are toxic. The final product, delivered by blowgun, kills monkeys without poisoning their meat, at the same time causing them to relax their grip and fall to the ground, instead of clinging in a death spasm to the tree. How did they develop a substance with such remarkable properties? The hallucinogenic brew, ayahuasca, is made up of 2 plants. One of them contains a hormone secreted in the human brain called dimethyltryptamine, a powerful hallucinogen, but when swallowed, it is rendered harmless by a stomach enzyme. It has to be mixed with a substance obtained from a creeper which prevents it from being broken down. Then it induces extraordinary visions. Interesting, I didn't know that. Now, in this part of Peru, shamans are known as ayahuasqueros because they claim that their power of healing or prophesying the future are bestowed by the drug, or rather by spirits who communicate when they are under the influence of the drug. Narby had been greatly impressed by the polycultural sorry about that. Narby had been greatly impressed by the polycultural gardens containing up to 75 different plants, mixed chaotically but never innocently. He asked a shaman named Ruperto, quote, "How do you learn all this?" End quote, and was told that if he wanted to understand, he must drink ayahuasca. The Colombian anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna confirms this in it. Oh God, sorry. In an essay in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology included in Shamans Through Time. He questioned 4 shamans in the Peruvian city of Iquitos, and all told him the same thing, that the spirits of the plants taught them what they know. One of them, Don Celso, told him that this is why shamans were better than Western doctors. Western doctors learn through books, but, quote, "we must take this liquid, ayahuasca, keep this diet, and then we learn," end quote. 2 weeks later, Ruperto offered Narby a bottle of a reddish liquid, which Narby describes as tasting like acrid grapefruit juice. Narby vomited and was told to drink more of it. Quote, "Suddenly I found myself surrounded by 2 gigantic boa constrictors that seemed 50 feet long. I was terrified. In the middle of these hazy thoughts, the snakes started talking to me without words. They explained that I am just a human being. I feel my mind crack, and in the fissures, I see the bottomless arrogance of my presuppositions. It is profoundly true that I am just a human being, and most of the time I have the impression of understanding everything, whereas here I find myself in a more powerful reality that I do not understand at all, and that, in my arrogance, I do not even suspect existed. I did not even suspect existed." End quote. At that point, he had to go outside again to vomit, stepping over fluorescent snakes, quote unquote. The new sense of reality had its terrifying aspects. Quote, "Language itself seemed inadequate. I tried to name what I was seeing, but mostly the words would not stick to the images. This was distressing, as if my last link to reality had been severed." Sorry, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. I do need to breathe more. More oxygen. Okay. Reality itself seemed to be no more than a distant and one-dimensional memory. And that's the end of the quote. He seemed to be vomiting colors and saw 2 beings on either side of him, one dark and one light. I've seen that. Story for another time. Instructions seemed to come from outside him. Time to stop vomiting, time to spit, to rinse his mouth. After hours of similar strange experiences, he fell asleep, exhausted. 2 days later, an Indian friend remarked that he should have brought his camera and photographed the snakes. Narby said that the vision would not appear on film, but was assured, quote, "yes, they would, because their colors are so bright," end quote. He assumed his friend was talking nonsense. Later he realized that nearly everything the Indian told him was true. Not long afterward, another Indian told him that he could cure Narby's long-standing back pain with a vegetal, it says vegetal, not vegetable, vegetal tea drunk at the new moon. Uh, Again, he was skeptical. In fact, the tea caused him to feel freezing cold, and his legs felt like rubber, but the back pain disappeared for good. An even odder piece of information was imparted to him. His information showed him a plant that could cure the bite of the deadly fer de lance snake. He noticed that the plant had tiny hooks resembling fangs and was told that this is the sign that nature gives. Again, he was skeptical, feeling that the plant's fangs must be coincidence, not a sign from nature. He watched a shaman cure a sick baby by blowing tobacco smoke on it, then sucking at a spot on its belly and spitting. When he asked about this, he was told that tobacco was the mother of ayahuasca, and the mother of tobacco was a snake. He was also told that souls, maninkari, like tobacco. When he asked about these souls, he was told they are invisible and fly through the air like radio waves, but that with tobacco or ayahuasca they can be seen. All these things Narby dismissed as superstitions. Back at home in Switzerland, he took his master's degree, then began to write a book about what he had learned in Peru. Quote, "What if it were true that nature speaks in signs, and that the secret to understanding its language consists in noticing similarities in shape or in form?" End quote. Man, I don't know why I am yawning so much. Oh. He began reading text on shamanism and was struck by the comment, quote, "You must defocalize your gaze so as to perceive science and the indigenous vision at the same time," end quote. Narby's study began with the chemistry of hallucinogens. These operate by mimicking the important human hormone serotonin, which is produced in the pineal gland in the middle of the brain, the so-called third eye. Serotonin is still something of a mystery. It seems to be connected with the evolution of intelligence. Men have more serotonin than animals. It looks as if its purpose may be to increase intelligence and inhibit sexual development. This may be why late developers tend to be more intelligent than earlier developers. Serotonin acts as a chemical messenger between brain cells, and it is speculated that serotonin and hallucinogens like mescaline and ayahuasca work like keys that fit a lock inside the brain. But what could that have to do with the enormous botanical knowledge of the Peruvian Indians? That's good stuff. Narby's first, the most important assumption was that the Indians could be telling the truth when they said that they learned about plants from their ayahuasca visions. Most scientists feel reasonably that the visions caused by Damn it! Most scientists feel reasonably that the visions caused by hallucinogens are simply created by the unconscious mind, in the same manner as dreams. But Narby felt quite certain that the fluorescent snakes who had told him he was merely human were more than dreams, and this led him to consider the apparently insane hypothesis that the shaman's information about plants came from the plants themselves. Jung, after all, believed that he could converse with certain beings who inhabited his unconscious mind, and that these people were objectively real. For Narby, one of Michael Harner's most significant comments was that his visions were emanating from giant reptilian creatures resting at the lowest depth of his brain, my italics. And he may recall that in a footnote, Harner had remarked that the creatures were like DNA, quote unquote. Narby was struck by the fact that the DNA molecule in fact looks like two intertwined serpents. Moreover, these serpents are joined by rungs which make DNA look like a kind of spiral ladder. From Eliot's book, he discovered that shamans the world over talk about ascending a ladder. Eliot adds that this is the earliest version of the idea of an axis of the world, quote unquote. Another anthropologist, Barbara Meyerhoff, who chewed peyote buttons under the guidance of Huichol shaman Ramon Medina in the 1970s, felt that she had been impaled on this axis. Quote, an enormous tree with its roots buried far below the earth and its branches rising above sight toward the sky, end quote. Man. At this point in Narby's book, I recalled that Keith Critchlow had also mentioned the world axis and went back to Time Stands Still. Critchlow remarks that the ideas seemed to be bound up with the pole star, which, as noted earlier, is often called the nail star or the sky nail, and is said to hold the world axis in place. The houses of shamans are built with a central pillar that goes up through the roof, and which symbolizes the world axis that the shaman has to climb to reach heaven. This pillar has 7 stories, just as the shaman's ladder has 7 rungs. It enables him to ascend through the 7 cosmic zones, which of course are reflected in our everyday speech when we say that some pleasure makes us feel as if we are, quote, in the 7th heaven, end quote. And I am sorry. It's not like it's been a long day. I did get up at 6. But hey, whatever. Moreover, the number 7 runs through world mythology, magic, and religion. In Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, 7 is defined as, quote, a mystic or sacred number, end quote. But why is it so universally associated with mysticism and magic? The British scholar Geoffrey Ashe once suggested that this is because there are 7 stars in Ursa Major, the Great Bear, but this is in the northern hemisphere, while 7 is revered as a magical number of the world over. He might also have noted that the Pleiades, or however you want to pronounce that, the Pleiades, are known as the 7 sisters. I would suggest that the answer lies in shamanism, which, with its 7-runged ladder, is also the same all over the world. It needs to be added that Eliot and Critchlow both point out that in shamanism, the number 9 also occupies a central place, and that some shamanic roof trees have 9 notches. 9 is also a very important number in Chinese culture. Well, 3 is, and then any multiple of 3 is. As is 8. But anyway. When Narby learned that Australian Aborigines declare that the world was created by a rainbow-colored snake with the aid of a quartz crystal, and that the Desana Indians of the Colombian Amazon, who drink ayahuasca, also speak of a cosmic anaconda and a quartz crystal, he had no doubt that this was no coincidence. In the 4 volumes of Joseph Campbell's work on world mythology, Narby found symbols of intertwined snakes, quote, in most images representing sacred scenes, end quote. And he found cosmic serpents who gave birth to the universe in Amazonia, Mexico, Australia, Sumer, Egypt, Persia, India, the Pacific, Crete, Greece, and Scandinavia. And in the Levant, the serpent creator had been revered for at least 7,000 years before the book of Genesis. Ooh, interesting. In the Levant, the serpent creator had been revered for at least... Random thought. Never mind. I won't bring it up. Narby was soon convinced that the intertwined serpents were a symbol of DNA, and most controversially, that shamans somehow communicate with DNA, or rather, the DNA communicates with the shamans. Quote, in their visions, shamans managed to take their consciousness down to the In their visions, shamans managed to take their consciousness down to the molecular level, end quote. And he noted that Gerardo Dalmatov, another Amazonia anthropologist, described his own visions under ayahuasca as, quote unquote, like micro photographs of plants. And so, quote, when they say the recipe for curare was given to them by the beings who created life, they are talking literally. When they say their knowledge comes from beings they see in their hallucinations, their words mean exactly what they say, end quote. Narby goes on, quote, I was staggered. It seemed that no one had noticed the possible links between the myths of primitive peoples and molecular biology. No one had seen that the double helix had symbolized the life principle for thousands of years around the world, end quote. Now, if true, this is certainly astonishing, and if the DNA can act as the teacher of shamans, we must also admit that it introduces a concept that all scientists hate, the notion of teleology, or purpose. Science is an attempt to study things under a microscope, and this works best if the things are inert. Then the universe, life, matter can all be explained in mechanical terms that raise no awkward problems. But Narby also, like, I don't know, I threw a word in there, but Narby, like Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, feels that this view has major drawbacks. Crick has objected to the notion that living cells or proteins were an accident that evolved from the primeval soup by chance, and calculated that the chance of a protein being built up from accidental collisions was 20 multiplied by itself 200 times, which is billions of times more than the number of atoms in the universe. Narby also makes the important comment, quote, according to the shamans of the entire world, one establishes communication with spirits via music, end quote. This is why shamans sing and dance. The central importance of music was recorded by the American ethnomusicologist Dale A. Olson in the mid-1970s. Among the Warao Indians of the Orinoco Delta of Venezuela, he noted that music was more important than tobacco in achieving trance states. They do not use mind-altering drugs. Quote, music combined with cultural conditioning produces, I believe, a pure trance state similar to the meditative trance state achieved by Buddhists while using music to reach enlightenment, end quote. He remarks that Warao, I'm not sure, shamans do not become possessed, but sink into deep meditation, during which they achieve contact with their supernatural helping spirits. The Warao shaman, I'm just going to say it that way. Warao. I'm going to just say Warao. Then I can't say it. The Warao shaman agreed to sing a bewitching song, taught to him by his supernatural teacher, explaining first that it would destroy the tape recorders, both the expensive recorder on loan from UCLA and the cheap one owned by Olson. The shaman ended his lengthy song by speaking about the great scissors of the spirit world that would destroy the machines of the foreigner, but the destruction would not be immediate. If he had wished to destroy them immediately, he would have smoked a long cigar, not a short one. Okay. A few weeks later, the prophecy came true. The batteries of the UCLA recorder leaked acid and destroyed the wires, while Olson's own recorder began to mangle tapes and broke beyond repair when he tried to fix it. This raises the obvious question of whether a shaman may use his powers to harm people. The answer, it seems, is yes, but in doing so, the shaman also harms himself. In an interview with a killing shaman, a shaman named Ashok from western Nepal tells the Danish anthropologist Peter Skafte how when business partners swindled him, he became angry and, quote, directed a deadly mantra against my partners, end quote. All three died, one falling ill, one catching dysentery, and one being hit by a car. Ashok was horrified, since he had vowed to the gods that he would only use his powers to serve others. Quote, and my fears came true. My little son and daughter became ill with terrible fevers and died within a month, end quote. According to the European magical tradition, the same is true of Western witchcraft. The witch who uses his or her powers to cause harm will become a victim of a boomerang effect. Yeah, the rule of three. What you send out comes back to you threefold. The general idea of that. How does it go? Lest in thy self-defense it be, ever mind the rule of three. Anyway, Fernando Payaguaya, a Secoyo shaman from Ecuador, dictated a book to his grandsons, who translated it into Spanish and published it under the title The Yage Drinker, Yage being ayahuasca. In this, the shaman explains how Yage can teach witchcraft. Quote, some people drink Yage only to the point of reaching the power to practice witchcraft. A much greater effort and consumption of Yage are required to reach the highest level, where one gains access to the visions and power of healing. It didn't end the quote. Okay. To become a sorcerer is easy and fast. I did not aspire to that, but to become the most wide and knowledgeable. Oh, there's the end of the quote. Sorry. And he tells how once he had achieved this level, quote, I felt able to practice witchcraft and to kill others, even though I never did, because my father's advice contained me. If you use that power now, you could kill someone, but then you would never get over being a sorcerer, end quote. Okay, so if you choose the easy path, it's like the dark side of the Force. You've gone down the path, and you're probably stuck there. American anthropologist Michael F. Brown studied the practices of the Jivaro Aguaruna Indians of Peru and noted that they regard sorcery as a deliberate attempt to murder and believe that sorcerers should be executed. Sorcerers like shamans are use sorry shamans sorcerers like shamans use spirit darts. The sorcerer uses them to inflict suffering on his enemies, while the shaman uses them to frustrate the evil activities of the sorcerer. It should be noted that all shamans and their patients believe that all life-threatening illness is a result of sorcery. This, of course, will strike Westerners as preposterous. Yet one Western anthropologist, Edith Turner, recorded how in 1985 she witnessed a curative ritual in Zambia in which she felt so close to the participant that she saw the harmful spirit, a large blob of gray plasma, emerge from the female patient's back. Quote, "Then I knew the Africans were right. There was a spirit affliction. It isn't a matter of metaphor and symbol or even psychology." End quote. And she says of the gray blob, quote, "It was a miserable object, purely bad, without any energy at all, and much more akin to the miserable ghosts of suicides." End quote. It sounds as if the blob had some kind of was some kind of energy vampire. Okay, interesting. Graham Townsley, a British anthropologist, lived among the Yamanahua Indians of the Peruvian Amazon in the early 1990s and heard about a secret language among shamans. He set out to decode it and to learn to overcome the force field between his own cognitive framework and that of the shamans. He explains that the central notion of the Yamanahua is that of Yoshi, meaning roughly spirit or animate essence. Everything in the world is given its essence by its Yoshi. The Yoshi is subject to the influence of other Yoshi, which explains illness. I'm struggling here. How much more? We got a long way to go. Wow. Long fucking way to go. 10 pages more. Okay. Keep on going. But Yoshi was not only the but God, fuck. Sorry, I am just not doing well on this tonight. But Yoshi are not only the essence of things or beings, they also have an independent existence in a supersensory realm. Yeah, that's what bookmarks are for, but I want to finish the chapter in one session. I hate having to break it up. But maybe I'll take a break and move around and wake up because I'm just struggling. So that's what I'll do. I will actually take a break, which I normally don't do in these sessions. And I'll be back. All right. See, I feel better just getting up and moving around for a minute. No, sometimes that's what it takes. You just got to get your blood pumping a little bit. All right, so. But Yoshi are not only the essence of things or beings, they also have an independent existence in a supersensory realm, and in this realm they are always ambiguous, like or not like, the same but different. Man consists of three parts: his body, then a social self associated with reason and language, then an entity that is neither social nor human, and that mingles easily with other Yoshi. The Yoshi involves the fundamental sameness of the human and non-human, which is why human can be transformed into non-human, men into animals. Singing is the essence of shamanism and the instrument of the shaman's power. Under the influence of ayahuasca, the Yamanahua shaman learns, quote, to sing, to intone the powerful chant rhythms, to carefully thread together verbal images coached in the abstruse metaphorical language of shamanic song and follow them. A song is a path. You make it straight and clean, then you walk along it. End quote. The shaman's healing power originates in his song, his koshuiti. Kosh is an imitation of the sound we make when we breathe in hoarse staccato breaths. The language of the koshuiti is made up of unusual words for common things. The songs are metaphoric, an analogy of the real situation that the song is intended to influence. Quote, confronted by an illness, a shaman sings a song to the moon, to an animal, or perhaps chants a myth. End quote. He is chanting to the non-human Yoshi who populate his visionary experience, and the language is densely metaphoric. Night becomes swift tapirs. The forest becomes cultivated peanuts. Fish are peccaries. Jaguars are baskets. Anacondas are hammocks. The result, Townsley says, is that the sense makes absolutely nonsense to non-humans. Non-shamans. Fish are, quote, white-collared peccaries, end quote, because of the resemblance of the fish's gills to the white dashes on this type of peccary's neck. And jaguars are baskets because of the resemblance of the loose-woven fiber of the basket to the jaguar's stripes. The Yamanahua shamans call this twisted language. The songs are intended with their imagery to create the clarity of visionary experience. The shaman says that normal words would make him crash into things. All this brings to mind the experience of an American school teacher who went to Hawaii in 1917 and began to study the old religion of the Hawaiian Indians, the Huna, which was guarded by priests named Kahuna, and found its secret in its language. His name was Max Friedman Long, and he would tell his story in a remarkable book called The Secret Science Behind Miracles. Born in 1890, he graduated from UCLA and went to Hawaii as part of a program to teach the children of government officials. Working in a remote valley, he set out to learn all he could about the ancient Huna religion, now forbidden by the white Christian authorities. Long met a museum curator named William Tufts Brigham, who told him that the kahuna could kill by means of the death prayer, and Long heard a story of a Christian minister who challenged a kahuna to a contest of prayer and was disconcerted to find that his congregation was dying one by one of some strange paralysis. Then the minister persuaded someone to teach him the death prayer, and the magician died within 3 days. Long also heard of a youth who had entered a forbidden temple to show he was not afraid, but whose legs became useless, so he had to be carried home. He had to go to a kahuna to be cured. Back in America, it struck him that he might learn some of the basic secrets of the kahunas through their language. Since Hawaiian words are built from shorter words, it ought to be possible to gather important clues from their sacred terms. He looked up spirit and found there are 2 words, unehipili and uhane, and he remembered that Christian missionaries declare that man has 2 souls. Later, Long discovered that the Hunas believe that man has, in fact, 3 souls. Besides the unehipili and the uhane, there is one called the aumakua. He concluded that the unehipili is what Freud called the unconscious, man's lower self. The uhane is the conscious everyday self, what might be called the middle self, and the aumakua is what might be called the higher self, or the superconscious mind. So, in addition to his unconscious mind, man has a superconscious mind, which is as far above everyday consciousness as the unconscious is below it. The psychical researcher F. W. H. Myers had suggested a similar theory in his classic work, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. Myers called the self that is able to exercise unknown powers the subliminal self. In his 1961 introduction to a reissue of Myers' book, Aldous Huxley suggested that it might be simpler to say that man has a Freudian unconscious, a kind of basement, a conscious ego, and a superconscious attic, of which we are all totally ignorant. These 3 selves seem to correspond to the 3 selves of the Hunas. The low self, say the Hunas, lives in the solar plexus, and its purpose is the manufacture of a vital source called mana. Mana is a life force that is created from food and is used by the 2 higher selves when stepped up in vibratory rate. Although the low self is the servant of the middle self, it is often refractory and disobedient. It likes its own way. It is naturally violent and emotionally like a spoilt child. The middle self, say the Hunas, i.e. us, should try to discipline the low self and raise it, rather than descend to its level, as self-indulgent people do. The human beings who give way to the tantrums of the lower self are simply storing up trouble for themselves. This can be seen in most criminals, particularly sex criminals. According to the Hunas, the high self could be regarded as a man's guardian angel, and it knows the future and can control it. So it sounds as if the high self is the part of us that is in charge of synchronicity and such things as dream precognition. The middle self, the everyday you, can in fact get in touch with the high self, but the problem is that it has to do so via the low self. It is as if the telephone line passes down through the low self before it goes up to the high self. And since the low self is usually in a state of negative emotion, the crackling on the line makes it difficult to communicate. It is only when the low self has achieved a state of calm or has been disciplined to behave itself that it is possible to get through to the high self and to learn the future. The death prayer, according to Long, works through low selves that have become detached, usually through death. These low selves are, for example, responsible for poltergeist disturbances. They are what are known as earthbound spirits, stupid but not particularly malevolent. Middle selves that have become detached after death have no memory, since memory is a function of the low self. These are what are called ghosts, and they exist in a kind of permanent present, unable to escape it. It would, however, be a mistake to assume that the low self is simply a kind of juvenile delinquent. In fact, Long's students came to refer to the low self as George, and pointed out that George can be extremely useful. He has all the penetration of a child, so that if one asks George what he thinks of a certain person, he is likely to go straight to the point. The middle self may feel that the person is intelligent and convincing. George can see at a single glance that he is a crook. According to Long, it is possible to get in touch with George and hold conversation with him. A person who has established this kind of close relation with George is in a far better position for establishing a fruitful relation with the high self. The high self, as already stated, can foresee the future and may well be the person who is responsible for those precognitions that J.W. Dunne wrote about in An Experiment with Time. According to Dr. Brigham, the kahunas can also look into the future and change it for their clients. But this is only possible if the client is not under the domination of the low self, because the low self tends to change its purposes and objectives from moment to moment. Long writes, quote, "Just how this mechanism works is uncertain, as it belongs to the next higher level of consciousness, but the kahunas spoke of the forms as seeds, which are taken by the aumakua, high self, and made to grow into future events or conditions." Quote, "The kahunas considered it of great importance for the individual to take time out at frequent intervals to think about his life and decide in exact terms what he wished to do or wished to have happen. The average person is too much inclined to let the low self take the helm, which is dangerous because it lives under the domination of the animal world, where things happen illogically and as if by accident. It is the business and duty of the middle self as guide for the low self to use its power of inductive reason and its will to control the low self in making plans for the task of living and seeing that proper efforts are made to work according to those plans." Long adds, quote, "A large part of the kahuna's magical practice in days gone by was aimed at seeing what crystallized future lay ahead for the client, then procuring changes in that future to make it more desirable." End quote. Long actually made use of a kahuna magician, a woman, during the Depression. In 1932, when a camera shop he owned was in danger of being bankrupt, after telling him that he must visualize with great clarity what it was he wanted, she explained how to make a prayer to the higher self so that it would be quite unambiguous. With her help, Long was able to sell his camera shop for a satisfactorily high sum. She ended by foretelling that Jung would write 8 books, which proved to be accurate. After such an experience, Long was naturally anxious to establish where the Hunas came from originally and whether their magical practices were known elsewhere, but that was made doubly difficult by the fear of the death prayer. When people became the victims of the death prayer, they first lost the use of their feet, then of their legs, and then the paralysis gradually spread upward until they died. Dr. Brigham told Long a story about a young Hawaiian boy who accompanied him on an expedition up Mount Mauna Loa to collect plant specimens, and how halfway up the mountain the boy began to experience paralysis in his feet, then in his legs. Other Hawaiians who were in the party assured Brigham that the boy was the victim of the death prayer, and, on questioning, the boy admitted that the old kahuna in his village had warned everyone to have no dealings with the white people on pain of death. An old man among the Hawaiians begged Brigham, who was regarded as a magician in his own right, to counter the death prayer. Brigham, who was quite sure that he had no magical powers, finally had to agree. He knew that the agents who carried out the orders of the kahuna were supposed to be spirits, low selves, separated from the rest of the being by death. But these spirits were also highly suggestible. Brigham stood above the sick boy and began to argue with the spirits, telling them that he realized that they were fine and intelligent creatures, and that it was a great pity that they had been enslaved by the kahuna. He told them that their real destiny was to go to heaven, and that in killing the boy they were simply obeying the will of an evil man. Some of the listening Hawaiians actually began to cry because they were so moved by Brigham's argument. Finally, Brigham ordered the spirits to go back and attack the kahuna. After a very long wait, Brigham felt a strange sensation as if all the tension had gone out of the air. At that moment, the boy discovered that he was able to move his legs. Not long after Brigham went to the boy's village and was told that the kahuna was dead. It had happened on the night Brigham had wrestled with the spirits. The kahuna had awakened with a scream and begun to fight off spirits, but because he had failed to put protection on himself, he was vulnerable and died before morning. It can be seen why Long had so much difficulty in learning anything about the religion of the kahunas and the death prayer. Long also tells the story of a boy who, in a spirit of bravado, walked into a forbidden temple in the forest and became paralyzed from the waist down. A kahuna priest had to be called in to free him from the curse. It was some time after reading this that I came upon a novel called The Empire of Darkness by the French Egyptologist Christian Jacques, and was struck by a sudden insight. It is the first of a trilogy called The Queen of Freedom, about the Princess Ahotep of Thebes, who in the 17th century BC had led a revolt against the foreign invaders called the Hyksos, the Shepherd Kings. In the 7th chapter, Princess Ahotep disregards the advice of the priests of Amun and enters the temple of the goddess Mut at Karnak to ask her help in fighting the invaders. Jacques writes, quote, "Yes, this temple was intensively alive. It exuded power in its own right." End quote. But although terrified and convinced she might die, she enters the sanctuary of the goddess, whose statue is in the form of a lioness. She prays aloud, but, quote, the only answer was silence, but it was not the silence of the dumb, for Ahotep sensed a presence like that of a landscape which spoke to the soul, end quote. But when Ahotep tries to take from the statue the scepter of power, it burns her hand and she falls unconscious. Suddenly it struck me that when Jacques says that the temple is alive, he meant it literally and was saying that Emil Shaker had said to me in the temple of Edfu. These temples had real power, like the power that had struck down the boy in the temple in Hawaii. This was not some primitive superstition, but the same recognition of the power of invisibles that Harner and Narby had become aware of in South America. For the first time, I felt I understood the religion of ancient Egypt. After the publication of his first book, Recovering the Ancient Magic, Max Friedman Long received a letter from a retired English journalist named William Reginald Stewart, who was able to throw an interesting light on the possible history of the Hunas. Stewart had been in Africa working as a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor when he heard about a woman who possessed magical powers and who belonged to the Berber tribe, the Aboriginal people of North Africa. Stewart was so interested in these stories that he hired guides and set out to find the tribe in the Atlas Mountains. There he discovered the female magician who was known among her fellow Berbers as a Kwahuna, obviously a variant of the Hawaiian word. With a great deal of persuasion, he was adopted by the tribe and also made the adopted son of the magician. Her name was Luchi, and her 17-year-old daughter was also beginning to train as a Kwahuna. So Stewart was allowed to become a second pupil. Okay, I am actually going to stand up. Because why not? I'm not going to fall asleep if I'm standing. Or if I do, I'll face plant and you'll all get a nice show. According to Lucci, there were originally 12 tribes of the people who had magicians called Kwahunas, and they once lived in the Sahara Desert when it was green and fertile. Then, said Lucci, the rivers had dried up and the tribes had moved into the Nile Valley. It was there that they used their magic to build the Great Pyramid. They became the rulers of Egypt and were highly regarded because of their magic. Lucci went on to tell how the prophetic powers of the Kwahunas enabled them to see that a time of intellectual darkness was due to fall on the earth and that the secret of their magic might be lost. So the 12 tribes began to hunt for isolated lands to which they might go to preserve their secret, for which the Hawaiian word is huna. The world was explored, not physically, but by psychic means. Eventually, they discovered that the islands of the Pacific were empty and made their way there via a canal to the Red Sea, then along the African coast and across India, but the 12th tribe decided to stay in Africa and moved to the Atlas Mountains, where they lived for centuries, preserving the secret and using its magic until the only Kwahuna left was Lucci. Much of what Stewart learned from Lucci corresponded closely with what Max Friedman Long had said in his book. Stewart also described Lucci's magical powers, how she was able to heal, control the weather, and exercise control over animals. Then Lucci was suddenly killed. 2 raiding parties began to shoot at one another, and a stray bullet struck the last of the Kwahunas. This was before the First World War, and it was 30 years later that Stewart read Long's first book and contacted him. It would seem impossible then that Kahuna magic originated in Africa before the building of the Great Pyramid, and that it had spread from there to the Pacific. Or it would seem possible. I think I said impossible. Long comments that Hawaiian legend states that the Hawaiians once lived in a homeland far away, and that they saw the land of Hawaii by psychic sight. Their voyage began at the Red Sea of Cain, and then moved from land to land in large double canoes. Long also adds that traces of Kahuna magic can be found in India. The notion of curses really working sounds absurd to the Western mind, but skepticism is likely to dissolve in the face of actual contact. And this is what happened to the eminent psychical investigator, uh, Guy Leon Playfair, when as a university graduate, he went to Rio de Janeiro as a schoolteacher in 1961. In The Flying Cow, Playfair describes how he became interested in a healer named Edivaldo who could open a patient's stomach with his hands and perform operations, after which he would close up the wound, which would become sealed again. Edivaldo operated on Playfair's stomach, and Playfair could feel his hands inside him. Playfair felt no pain, only an anesthetized sensation, and after Edivaldo had closed up the wound, there was a thin red line on his midriff. After a second similar operation, Playfair's problem was cured. Playfair describes how he joined the Brazilian equivalent of the Society for Psychical Research and investigated a number of poltergeist cases. As a result, he quickly reached the conclusion that poltergeist activity is not simply a matter of RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, as most Western paranormal investigators assume, but that poltergeists are spirits, although he does not rule out the RSPK explanation in certain cases. And he discovered in Brazil that Umbanda, or spirit magic, specialists can put spells on people and induce poltergeists to invade their homes. He investigated a series of disturbances that had been going on for 6 years, which was finally cleared up by a team led by a candomblé magician, candomblé being a Brazilian equivalent of voodoo. In a chapter of his book, The Indefinite Boundary, called The Psy Underworld, he gives several examples of hauntings induced by black magic. Playfair himself, fortunately, had never been the subject of such a curse, but it happened to his friend David St. Clair, who describes it in his book Drum and Candle. St. Clair had been living in Rio de Janeiro for 8 years and had a comfortable apartment with a fine view. He also had an attractive maid named Edna, a pretty brown-colored girl. She was, he assures the reader, a maid and nothing more. Her life had been hard. Deserted by the father, her family had been brought up in a shack in a slum. She was obviously delighted with the comfort and security of her job with St. Clair. She joined a folk dance group, and after a television appearance became something of a local celebrity. And one day St. Clair told her that he had decided it was time for him to leave Brazil. Edna was now doing so well that he had no doubt that she would easily find another job. He told her he would give her 6 months' wages. It was then that things began to go wrong. A book he had written failed to make any headway. His typist made a mess of it, then fell ill so that it sat in her desk drawer for weeks. A New York publisher rejected it. An inheritance he was expecting failed to materialize. His plans for moving to Greece had to be shelved. A love affair went disastrously wrong, and a friend he asked for a loan refused it. He even fell ill with malaria. One day he met a psychic friend in the Avenida Copacabana. She took one look at him and said, quote, "Someone has put the evil eye on you. All your paths have been closed." End quote. A few days later, another friend wrote to say he had been to an Umbanda session, and a spirit had warned him that one of his friends was in grave danger due to a curse. All his paths had been closed. An actor friend immediately divined that it was Edna who had put the curse on him. St. Clair thought this absurd. To begin with, Edna was a Catholic and had often expressed her disapproval of Spiritism and Umbanda. But his actor friend told him he had attended a spiritist session where he had been assured that David St. Clair's apartment was cursed. But how would Edna go about doing that? St. Clair wanted to know. All she had to do, his friend replied, was to go to a Quimbanda black magic session and take some item of his clothing, which could be used in a ritual to put a curse on him. And now that his friend mentioned it, St. Clair recalled that his socks had been disappearing recently. Edna had claimed the wind was blowing them off the line. St. Clair told Edna he believed himself to be cursed. She pooh-poohed the idea, but he told her he wanted her to take him to an Umhanda session. After much protest, she allowed herself to be forced into it. That Saturday evening, Edna took him to a long white house in a remote area outside Rio. On the walls were paintings of the devil Exu. Toward midnight, drums started up, and the Negroes sitting on the floor began to chant. A ritual dance began. Then the Umbanda priestess came in like a whirlwind, a huge negress dressed in layers of lace and a white silk turban. She danced, and the other women began to jerk as if possessed. The priestess went out, and when she came in again, was dressed in red, the color of Exu, Satan. She took a swig of alcohol, then lit a cigar. After more dancing, she noticed St. Clair and offered him a drink from a bottle whose neck was covered with her saliva, when she spat a mouthful of the alcohol into his face. After more chanting, a medium was asked who had put the curse on him. She replied, quote, "The person who brought him here tonight. She wants you to marry her. Either that or to buy her a house and a piece of land." End quote. The priestess ordered Edna to leave. Then she said, quote, "Now we will get rid of the curse." End quote. There was more ritual drumming and dancing. Then the priestess said, "Now you are free. The curse has been lifted, and it will now come down doubly hard upon the person who placed it on you." End quote. When he protested, he was told it was too late. It had already been done. 3 days later, St. Clair received a telegram from a magazine asking for a story. He had suggested it to them months before, but they had turned it down. Now, unexpectedly, they changed their minds and sent him money. A week later, the inheritance came through. The book was accepted, and 10 days later he received a letter asking if his broken love affair could be restarted where it had left off. Then Edna became ill. A stomach growth was diagnosed, and she had to have an operation for which St. Clair paid. But her health continued to decline. She went to see an Umbanda priest who told her that the curse she had put on St. Clair had rebounded on her and that she would suffer as long as she stayed near him. She then admitted trying to get him to marry her by black magic, after which she declined his offer to buy her a house or an apartment and walked out of his life. So the worldview of the shaman, based on the notion of the reality of spirits, receives support not only from many anthropologists, but from an increasing number of those engaged in psychical research. I don't know why I keep doing that. As we shall see in a later chapter, such evidence was accepted by Charles Hapgood and was almost certainly played a part in convincing him of the existence of, quote, advanced levels of science that may go back 100,000 years, end quote. And end chapter. Finally, it really helped when I stood up. I woke up pretty well, so that's good. But yeah, that is the end of that chapter. And then, again, not even a single mention of the Neanderthals or a freaking kingdom. But he did at least mention the 100,000 years, which is the subtitle here, the 100,000 years of lost history. But, yeah, I want to know where the Neanderthals fit into it all, because that's the interesting part. You want to link Atlantis and the Neanderthals together. I hope he starts doing it soon. There are only 4 chapters left. So, anyway, that is it for that reading. I know it took longer than usual, an hour and 20 minutes, but part of that was a break. So, Anyway, we will end the session, and I'm going to take another quick break, try to wake up a little bit more, and come back to play some Stalker because I was supposed to play it last night, but I played tonight's game, which would normally be We Happy Few. So I'm just going to swap them so I get some play time in each game through the week instead of skipping one. So I'll be back in a few minutes to do that. See you then.